And now here with the Center Square Daily, we're talking with Jonathan Williams, President and Chief Economist of the American Legislative Exchange Council, co-author of their latest Rich States, Poor States report. Jonathan, thanks for taking time with us. Any surprises in this year's data compared to previous editions?
Well, thanks for having me. And, sometimes as things change, they still stay the same in a lot of ways in terms of the top and bottom of the rankings. But there was a ton of movement throughout the course of this year in the rankings, because obviously we have these 50 laboratories of democracy. They know immediately they're competing with each other in states all across the country. And that's a very healthy thing in this idea of federalism that our founders gave us. And so every single year we see lots of great movement in the upward direction, and obviously some states slipping behind. There are some constants, though. You have states like Utah at number 1, states like New York at number 50. Those states have been cemented there for a long number of years now. We were just celebrating with our Utah delegation here in Washington, D.C., who flew in, was at the White House with us, and then on Capitol Hill to launch the rankings for Tax Day. And they have been 19 years, all editions of Rich States, Poor States, at the number 1 spot for economic outlook. So an incredible success story.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about Utah here in a bit, but before we get to some of the factors that made Utah the place it is right now, you had 15 different policy variables you guys looked at. Which ones are you seeing were the strongest predictive power for future growth?
Well, yeah, we look at 15 factors, equally weighted, and there are things that Art Laffer, my co-author, has studied for 50 years that he knows matter for economic growth and what makes some states rich and some states poor. But, you look at some of the most important of them. Look at taxes and regulation, labor policy, the size of government and the size of the government workforce, for instance, government spending, all very important factors. But I think if you had to isolate out just one or two, the personal income tax is one of the very most damaging ways that states go about raising revenue. And the states that avoid a personal income tax, and there are 8 states today that have zero personal income tax, they're some of the fastest growing states in the country. Texas, Florida, Tennessee being the best known states without a personal income tax, but you have other smaller states like Wyoming, South Dakota, and New Hampshire, Nevada, Alaska. And, it's an incredibly important element. It's not just the wage income to help individuals and families, and that's very important for affordability reasons across the United States. But the vast majority, we're talking 99+% across each and every state, of small businesses pay on the individual side of the tax code, not on the business side. So when you're talking about reducing or eliminating state personal income taxes, you're actually talking about a direct tax cut or tax elimination for those entrepreneurs, those mom and pop startups, or those businesses that are anchoring Main Street all across the United States. And so if you're to isolate out one of the 15 variables, I always like to look at the personal income tax.
Other variables you guys checked out as well: right to work laws, minimum wage laws. Some of these seem to impact employers and how much it costs them to hire employees.
Well, that's right. And we look at business taxes as well that have a direct effect there. Right to work's an important variable. In my home state of Michigan, we've gone back and forth on right to work, as you know, over the last decade or so. But as we work with job creators across the United States who are ALEC members on the private sector side, or even those site selectors, for instance, that we work with, the businesses have a ton of options, right? And then states are all looking for these employers to create jobs in their state. Some states go with economic handouts, and other states just offer good free market policies. Of course, that's the best way to compete. But one of the things that we've found as we've talked to these job creators and the site selectors is right to work is a key factor. In fact, the ability of individuals to work regardless of being forced to join a union ranks right up there for those employers to say sometimes even a state won't even be in consideration for a future investment unless it's a right to work state. It's a yes or no variable in rich states, poor states, and many times it is a yes or no variable for those site selectors and job creators. So I think those two factors are really important, but you could go through, if we had an hour, and spend on all 15 of the variables to talk about why they matter for either employees or individual taxpayers or both.
I do want to talk about several specific states here in a moment, but considering those factors, right? You guys are looking at growth. You're looking at how much an economy is growing state by state, and some of the factors that you're saying could play a role into that. Are you seeing any give from some of those lower tiered states to recognize that they can actually generate more tax revenue if it's a sales tax or whatever it may be, if they have more economic activity. Have you seen in your time with ALEC and these rich state, poor state reports that recognition?
Yeah, you do. I mean, for they have to the deep blue states, the progressive states have to get over their progressive ideology, though, to be able to get there. They have to think practically to say, what will it take to grow our state outside of this framework of a Bernie Sanders or AOC style framework to say you always have to soak the rich. Well, guess what? Taxes don't redistribute income. They redistribute people. Americans vote with their feet, and it's not like states can build walls to keep their people in, right? They're going to leave. And every year we track this migration data from the IRS and from the Department of Census, and we see millions of Americans voting with their feet across state lines. And that's what makes it so difficult for the progressive ideology, is it becomes this vicious cycle of higher taxes, drive out wealth creators and taxpayers. They take their revenue with them. It leaves a deficit. And then what do? They have to go back because of their progressive ideology and say, well, we got to raise taxes again. And that just starts the cycle all over. So the bottom 10 states are in a lot of ways stuck in mired in their clay in the bottom 10, but you do see some breakout opportunities. For instance, I'll give you one, which is in Colorado, a state that was reliably red and conservative for many years, has drifted to the progressive side in recent years. But you have a Democrat governor today, in the case of Jared Polis, their former member of Congress, who's pretty liberal on other issues in some ways, but he has said he wants to eliminate the personal income tax in Colorado for economic growth reasons and economic development. He understands they're competing directly with so many competitive states in the Mountain West that for practical reasons, back to this divide between practicality and ideology from the kind of the left-leaning states, you see some really great gold nuggets there when it comes to statements from Governor Polis.
Jonathan Williams, president and chief economist at ALEC, also co-author of the Rich States, Poor States report. Let's go ahead and talk about some of these other states. Utah, as you mentioned, holding that number one slot for economic outlook for how many years now? What's behind that?
All 19 years, right? It's what a success story. And we were with, like I said, the Senate President and Speaker of the House, their congressional delegation this week. So many great things behind it. And if we had an hour, I could unpack it all. But in the Cliff Notes version, they've done property tax reform. That's been a number one challenge in every state I've been to in the last couple of years, is rising property taxes. You know it well in Illinois. We see it all across the country, though. Utah's really helped get ahead of that to bring transparency and accountability with their truth in taxation law. They've also solved an issue that's vexed Illinois and other blue states, and that is these unfunded pension liabilities that threaten bond ratings and drive up taxes across the board. They've transitioned their new hires into more of a 401k style retirement for government workers. And another thing that Utah's done is they became a flat tax state in the first edition of Rich States, Poor States. And now we've seen really a flat tax revolution sweep America coming, especially out of the pandemic, of states realizing they needed to compete as people had more freedom and where they could work anywhere in the country for jobs these days with the remote workforce. Utah was a real pioneer when it comes to things like that. So many good things to say about Utah, and that's exactly why they stay at number one. The other thing I should mention is just the leadership of Utah. They're not consistent to stay where they're at, even if they have been number one for a decade plus. They're always looking behind their shoulder to say, who are the states catching us and what can we do to stay one step ahead? And at the end of the day, that's what it takes to be number one for 19 years.
Well, as you said, I mean, the United States is set up with 50 mini democracies, labs of what works and what doesn't. And reports like this really help elucidate what is those key factors. Now, Florida, another state, jumping in your most recent report for outlook, going 10 spots. What's driving that momentum?
Well, Florida's been a long time a powerhouse state. They've had some struggles in recent years with property tax burdens, with insurance costs, especially around hurricane and property and casualty insurance. But they've begun to take some important steps, and they've done tort reform, for instance, to start to get the cost down for insurance. And they're addressing property taxes. I know Governor DeSantis and Speaker Perez and others have been working on looking at solutions for property taxes. And so Florida being the underlying fundamental fundamentals, of course, are just phenomenal for Florida. No income tax, right to work state. They get so many of the big picture things right that they've been a massive in-migration state. It's a great success story to say, hey, without an income tax, they've been able to keep spending limited relative to other large states. And that formula has worked so well for so many people where, people are going to Florida in droves and they continue to move there coming out of the pandemic, because it's not just the weather, the climate when it comes to the weather, the climate when it comes to the economy, businesses, and individual taxpayers.
Now let's talk about the bottom of the lists that you got for the rich states, poor states. California, New York, another populated state, Illinois, all ranking down in the bottom three in some of your categories here. Talk about what they're doing wrong to end up cemented, as you said, down in the lower tier here.
Well, Ronald Reagan had a great line when he talked about the liberal view of the economy can be summed up as this: if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. And if you think about the philosophy of the states that have been in the bottom for so many years, that's really what it is every time there's a budget problem, they go back to entrepreneurs and individuals and ask for more of tax money. They regulate and they make it very difficult to start a new business or to operate a business in many cases. And then the way they compete, instead of through a free market competition of lower rates for everybody in a competitive environment, they compete by giving special handouts to their favorites. We could call it cronyism. You can call it a lot of different things. A lot of people sitting in jails and prisons in places like Illinois, New Jersey, and New York because of the corruption as well. But that is the way a lot of these states at the bottom compete. They have high tax rates on everybody, and they play winners and losers when it comes to government policy. Exactly the wrong thing to do. And don't take my word for it. Don't take Alex's word for it. Look at how many people are leaving those states. I mean, Illinois down 1 million over the last decade, New York down nearly 2 million over the last decade. It wasn't that many years ago. New York was larger than Florida by population. Now they're millions behind Florida as Florida's surged with the in-migration trends. New York's lost. Something that just caught my eye the other day, you may have seen it. Governor Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, was giving a talk in West Palm Beach to businesses there and essentially begging them to come back to the state of New York. After driving them out with the high taxes and this regulation and the cronyism, she literally said that New York is essentially a charity case today and they need their revenue. And so please come back and do business in New York. Folks, that's not how businesses decide to go do business in a state. They go for what works best for their employees, their shareholders, and the company long term. And that's exactly what the top tier of states offers. And it's exactly the problem with the bottom tier of states and rich states, poor states.
Well, Jonathan Williams, president and chief economist at ALEC and co-author of the Rich States, Poor States report. Greatly appreciate you taking time here with the Center Square.